Welcome to the Coach's Table Podcast, where coaches come to grow personally and professionally through real-world application and online education. What is going on, everybody? Man, I tell you what, it's crazy because now with all the seasons happening, right now it's crazy because you have football that's still playing, volleyball that's ending, soccer that's pretty much ending, and then you got basketball that's starting. So if you're a sports fan, which I think you are because you're listening to this, then it's probably like the best season because you're like, man, I get everything, and you don't know what to watch because there's so much going on constantly. But guys, hey, look, the guest that I have on, I'm super excited about it. We've been talking a decent amount here consistently, and I think he's just an intelligent guy, and so I'm super excited to have him on. But before we do that, do us a huge favor, okay? Share the show. That's the only way the show grows. That's the only way that we get the word out and we can help more coaches. I get a lot of great feedback from y'all. So if you're listening, do us a huge favor. Share the show. It takes 10 seconds to do that, whether it's on Instagram or whatever other social platform you're on. And if you would do us a favor and leave a review. The review is the most important thing because it lets other coaches, other individuals know that this is worth listening to. You guys have done a great job so far, but it's not just in general. You need to do it for every single episode. So without further ado, Mr. Hunter Eisenhower, man, what's going on?
What's going on, Kendrick? Thanks for having me on, dude.
Yeah, man, thanks for coming on the second time.
Yeah, this could I guess this could be a part 2 right now.
Yeah, it really could be. I mean, we didn't get anything on the first one, obviously. That's the best part. I mean, I say this all the time, but it's literally the truth, man. What happens, and maybe you, with you as well, because you have a pod, but it's like you get on, you start talking to them, and they're like, man, this is great. The conversation flows, and it's like 40 minutes, 45 minutes, and you're like, damn, dude, we didn't even hit record, but we should have recorded that whole thing.
Yeah, I know that happens sometimes. We probably did that on a couple of our pods or podcasts early on, and now it's just like, hey, what's going on, man? Record, and then it's like Mike, my co-host, does all the editing, and I'm like, hey, sorry, you might have to edit out a lot of stuff, but we might as well just get all this junk on the front end.
Yeah. I mean, because the conversation typically on the front end is also just really good, and it just goes. It's like, man, I'm serious. I say it all the time, and I'm like, damn, I should have just recorded that. But I also feel like there's a level of time where it's like, hey, we're not recording. Let's just kind of, we kind of need that too.
It creates a little bit more of like a conversation, I think. Like it's canned, just talking about stuff back and forth, and it's like, all right, let's record, and it's like, okay, here we go. Like, let's get, and it's like, no, let's just like keep that same candid flowing,
Yeah. How's Chicago though?
It's cool. It's cold. We got here, and I have been living in Arizona for the last 6 months, and I forgot what like 40 degrees felt like. No, but it's good. I'm excited. We play Mississippi State tonight, which is very exciting. It's our first official game, so it should be a good test for us right out of the gates.
Yeah, man, that's exciting. So for those that don't know, Hunter is a strength and conditioning coach at Arizona State. Got there recently, 8 months ago now.
Yeah, yep.
And is with the men's basketball program there, which is awesome. Previous to that, he was with the Sacramento Kings, which was really cool too. How long were you with them for? 3 years?
No, I was only there a year. So I was at UC Davis for about 2 years, and then I went to Sacramento, and then I also worked with Stockton, the G League team. I was here, and then this opportunity presented itself, and I scratched the itch of the NBA and G League, and I felt as if I could be there a little bit longer, but if a really good college job presented itself, that I wanted to pursue it, and Arizona State happened to be one of my dream schools, so I was like, I have to pursue this, and very fortunate that it worked out.
So how different is the NBA, G League, SNC thought process compared to college?
It's a good question. I would say that, well, from one end, there's a lot of like cooks in the kitchen in the NBA. I was one of 4 strength coaches. There's a medical staff of, with Sacramento, it was 5. And then that's just on like the performance side of things. But you also have the front office who weighs in on certain things that they think or want from the individual players. Maybe it's like body weights, like, hey, I want this guy at X amount of weight. So you just have a lot of opinions and a lot of people. Now, what a lot of people think is, oh, that's like the high performance model. Like, that's what I want. That's what I want to try to create in college. And it's tough to do because you don't have anywhere near the resources. Even if you're at a Power Five school, like the resources just aren't matched. You're not going to have 4 strength coaches in the collegiate setting to where you can focus on 4 to 5 guys at a time throughout the entire year. So from that perspective, it's you have so many opinions and you have so much collaboration and you have so many specialists. Like what I thought was interesting is that at least for the other assistant, and then the head strength coach for the Kings, like you could really dial into the weight room and performance and those type of things. Now, the head strength coach also did some of like the manual therapy. So he kind of like double dipped. And then the director of performance also does the sports science. So he double dips a little. But you're able to really be like in that space. I think that from the training perspective, I think what was interesting to me active is I think that college athletes kind of just understand or accept what traditional training looks like. And what I mean by that is if you just walked into a collegiate weight room with a new team and you just wanted to like back squat, bench press, and deadlift, I think a lot of them would be like, oh, this is just what the weight room is like. This is what I'm supposed to do. But walking into an NBA weight room, if you told some of these guys, hey, we're going to back squat today, and then on Wednesday we're going to deadlift, and then on Friday we're going to bench press, they would be like, no, I'm not doing that. So it kind of like opened my eyes. I think that I tried to break from tradition a little bit anyways from my perspective, but I think it really makes you have to get creative in ways to train certain qualities without putting these guys in positions and with exercises that they don't enjoy because the NBA allows them so much autonomy.
And so the athletes really have influence or the ability just to say, no, I'm not doing that. Whereas college, it's like, this is the program. This is what we're doing. Let me make some mods, when required, but everybody's going to do this regardless of, and that's kind of a big difference that y'all saw.
Yeah. I can't think of like a situation when a guy was just like, no, I'm not doing this. But there was more of like an autonomous nature to that setting, where guys could be like I don't want to lift today, or hey, can we go after practice, or hey, let's lift on the road tomorrow when we get to blank city.
This episode is sponsored by TeamBuilder. TeamBuilder is the #1 performance platform for strength coaches around the world. Their software provides coaches with an elevated experience when it comes to program development, data tracking, and staying connected with athletes and clients. Coaches also have access to consultations with TeamBuilder's in-house sports scientists to help manage and analyze data. Head to teambuilder.com and sign up with promo code TABLE to start your free 30-day trial. That is TeamBuilder, TeamBuildr.com, and sign up with promo code TABLE to start your free 30-day trial. Coaches, this podcast is sponsored by Samsung Equipment. They have been providing elite strength training equipment and professional weight room solutions since 1976. If you value product quality, great customer service, and a company with integrity, make Samsung Equipment your go-to. Visit them at samsungequipment.com and let them know the Coaches Table podcast gave you a seat at their table. That is Samsung Equipment, SAMSON equipment.com, and let them know the Coaches Table podcast gave you a seat at their table.
And in college, it's just like a little bit more regimented. Now there's probably I've dealt with some like, hey, class went long, can I lift out for practice today? Like that type of stuff. So it definitely level, but you also have to think that now I'm not saying that the value of the college player is any lower, but like look at paychecks, like some of the
Yeah.
NBA players, millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars. So the whole like risk versus reward thing is also heightened. And I think that that's why you kind of steer away from some of these like quote unquote riskier exercises. Like, why would you put a bar on somebody's back when you can do we had like a very nice leg press. I forgot the brand, but anyways, it was a very nice $40,000 leg press, and it was like if you can train similar qualities or the same qualities on this leg press when they're not in a vulnerable position at all, like why would I put a bar on their back and squat them?
Right.
And there's guys that did like early off season. There was some guys that put a bar on their back and squatted, but like I was gonna air even like the two-way that I really like focused in on. I was like, okay, if I were to get one of these guys hurt in the weight room, like I, so like you have to weigh the risk versus reward. And at that level, I think it's even more imperative because of the nature of that business.
Yeah. Yeah. And like the product is, I mean, even in college, like the product is them, right? Like they are the product. They are the ones going out and playing. They're the ones that everybody sees and expects to see. And they're the ones that everybody pays for to see. And
Yep.
so, like, I had a similar experience when I was really young in the career. I was in the private sector in Georgia, and we had some professional athletes. They were professional football players and baseball players. And I was just learning the ropes of everything, right? And for whatever reason, the football player was doing Olympic lifts, right? And like catching it. And he's like, no, I'm not going to catch it. And I was so young and naive, like I didn't understand it. And I was like, what do you mean? Like, he's not going to catch it. Like, that's the exercise. Like, you're going to catch it, like, because I just didn't know, right? And the owner comes over to me. He's like, hey, look, man, like, that guy just signed a 5-year deal with like 40 million or whatever, right? He's like, if he doesn't want to catch it, he's not going to catch it. And I'm like, cool, sounds good. Like, awesome. Like, I mean,
Yeah.
I know he's a professional athlete. I was like, but I just didn't. And he's like, yeah, it hurts my wrist. And I'm like, cool. The guy's like, that dude's wrists are worth so much money. I'm like, all right, man. Like,
Yeah.
but now
And
that I've progressed,
no,
like,
that's a good point because like they are the product. So
yeah,
I'm not saying that you shouldn't allow your athletes autonomy at the college level because I do that. And like if a guy doesn't like a certain exercise, we can make adjustments. Like
yeah, yeah,
it's the quality, it's the stimulus that you're searching, not necessarily the exercise. But I think at that level, especially, these guys are making however much money. This is their body, their work is their business. So
yeah,
they should probably be able to have a little bit of autonomy over how they want to treat their body. And I mean, I take that same approach in college. I don't know what it's like to do this exercise in that body. So if you're telling me that this is creating some type of discomfort, or you like this more, or you want to try this, or hold the barbell this way or the dumbbell this, like, okay, let's try it. As long as you're within the bandwidth of safety and the same movement with quality, uh, like quality, yeah, roll with it because that's a really good point. You product.
yeah. So with that, like with college, because I think we can all make this statement that some guys in college are not as mature as the guys are in the pros, right? Or they don't take it seriously, or they're kind of looking for that scapegoat, if you will. And this isn't everybody, but we all know that we have some athletes that are like that. And with the approach that you're taking, I like it. I kind of take a very similar approach. How do you kind of manage those individuals that are just trying to do the bare minimum, are just trying, because what athletes can do is say, like, everything gives me discomfort, so we're not going to do that. And it's like, okay, well, that's not true either, right? Like, we know
Yeah.
that's not true. How do you kind of approach that? Because I'm sure not only you, myself, but the other coaches have had people where it's like, we provide them autonomy. You give them an inch and they try and take a mile.
Yeah, for me, it's just autonomy is earned in all realms, whether it's changing an exercise or moving a lift post practice or reducing some volume because you're feeling pretty beat up. Like when you come in as a freshman, especially during the off season, I know that there's going to be certain things that probably cause basketball. Like if a 6'9" lanky freshman walks in, I'm probably not just going to like try to back squat. I'm trying to back squat. I'm trying to back squat. I'm like, I like an exercise that might work too well with that type of body type, but like there's going to be certain things that potentially could cause discomfort. But first, I'll give you an example. So we have a freshman. He came in and like a lot of young kids that come in to play college basketball right now, all they do is play basketball. So he just had a couple of which very prominent patellar tendonitis. So he's like always about his knees. Every basketball strength coach in the world knows.
Yes.
And I love rear foot elevated split squats.
Yes.
And he would say, this really hurts my knees. This really hurts my knees. And I'm like, pretty much any loaded knee flexion right now, especially with any type of like knee over toe, is probably going to feel a little bit like uncomfortable. But like maybe we'll hit like an ISO at the bottom. Maybe we'll hit a tempo, like slow down, slow up. But you have to trust me that like doing this and moving through a full range of motion over time will help that knee feel better. So in that situation, a kid is telling me like, hey, this is uncomfortable, this hurts. And I'm like, no, trust me on this. Do this exercise, do it through a full range of motion. We don't have to load the shit out of it right away, but it'll probably help you feel better. Now I have some guys, especially now that we're in the in-season period, on the other end of the spectrum that are going to play 38 minutes tonight. And if they come to me at some point during the week, next week or the following week or whenever, and they say, yo, I'm feeling like super beat up, okay, hit your main stuff. We're going to take all your accessory stuff out of the program and hit some whatever you want, recoverability, like whatever it may be. Because again, I don't know what it feels like to play 38 minutes in a Power 5 college basketball game. I think my highest minutes I got to in a college basketball game at the Division II level was like 20. So I'm like half of that at a lower level. That's what I know what it feels like. So I don't even know what I don't know what 40 feels like level. And I can only imagine how they feel after some of these games. So especially if you're playing, I'm going to keep the main thing and allow you to kind of dictate your training a little bit. But something I tell them is like, don't take advantage of that because we have to train. Like there's going to be days you don't feel like it. And there's going to be days that I'm going to tell you, hey, we're doing all this. And you just kind of have to trust me because if we take every other day off throughout the entire year, by the time we get to the end of the year, you're going to be in a really bad spot.
Right. That was going to be my next question, because we see this all the time, right? Especially like, for instance, on the road, right? Guys think like, oh, cool, we're just going to go on the road and then I just get to hoop and I just get to lay around all day and not do anything. It's like, no, that's actually probably more detrimental to you than training, right? It's like we're catching flights and then buses, and then you're in a hotel room, and then you're sitting for film, and then you got shoot around, and you have a couple practices and stuff. But those practices are more so like, hey, let's just stretch the legs a little bit, just get moving. And then guys are like, oh, I'm just gonna lay in my hotel room the entire time. It's like, nope, let's go train. Like, I promise you that's gonna be more beneficial for you. Or, hey, I know you're a little beat up right now, but just movement in general right now is going to be a great thing for you. And it's really interesting to kind of to see that, especially with the guys that play a lot of minutes. Like I just had a conversation with our guys that played a lot of minutes the other night, and it's like, hey, what do you want to do? Like, how are you feeling? Because I know we need to hit these things, these qualities, and I want to hit them, and I know that we need to hit them. But like, how are you feeling right now? Because you got to go play 36 minutes tonight as well. And
Yeah.
I don't. I feel great. Or like the guys that aren't playing, hey, yeah, like let's go crazy. We're going to push you, because I don't care if you're sore, because
Yeah.
unfortunately you're just not going to play tonight. Like,
Yeah.
and how do
Yeah.
you manage that? How would you manage that like when you were in the league? Because I feel like that would be hard too, especially if guys have, I don't want to say so much autonomy, but a lot more autonomy. Because you're sitting
Yeah.
here as a strength coach, we think our job is the most important thing, right? But we're sitting here and saying, okay, I know I need to hit all these qualities. We should be sprinting. Okay, I want to get some jump numbers on you just to know where we're at. Like, are we touching that max quality or is it all just sub max? Oh, what about sprinting? Oh, what about strength and speed strength? And we got all these things like we need to hit all this. How do you kind of manage that at an NBA level when you were there and then at where you're at right now with a lot of the autonomy? I mean, I think we kind of answered the latter.
Yeah. I mean, here our schedule works out. I think it's going from a NBA and G League schedule to this schedule. I'm like, dang, we have like so much time to train. We have so much time at home because last year it was dealing with kind of like what you're dealing with right now, like prolonged road trips. And it's like, well, shoot, we got to get a couple hotel lifts in. But I think that one thing that's really nice here, coming back to the college level, is like we play tonight, but we train Monday and we'll train when we get back. So like we'll have we really train Monday, Tuesday. We flew out Tuesday night. We'll play Wednesday. We'll fly back, train again Friday. We'll play Saturday. So like we have ample training time at home, and our schedule just works in a way that we don't really have prolonged trips. So
That's
like
nice.
the longest trip that we're going to be on is once we get to the Pac-12 and we play like Thursday, Saturday, and we leave on a Wednesday and come back Saturday night. So for a a lot of those 5 minute guys, we'll get all our training before we even leave. Maybe like some stuff, 2 games if they want to, and then I'll just train low minute guys in between the games on that Friday. So um, in this schedule, it's not easy by any means in terms of training and fitting training in, especially in the non-conference because it's kind of weird. But I think that comparing it to what I was dealing with last year, it seems so much more simple. And then last year, it's it's a very dense schedule, obviously, but I think that if you kind of like communicate guys the schedule and create a rhythm with them, they just kind of know what to expect. I think
Yeah.
the things that I think the things that are tough for them is just like they get done with a really hard practice or they just got done playing 35 minutes and it's like, hey, post game lift, like let's go. And then they're like, what the hell? But if you make sure like so for me with Stockton, whenever we would do a post game lift, I would always make sure that the coach that sent out the schedule put it on the schedule when they sent out like the weekly schedule. I would always
Yeah.
make sure that it was on their spot and they knew. And I always like make one or two jokes to a couple guys about it just to like
Yep.
make sure it
Yep.
was fresh in their head because when the game ended, yeah, they may have forgot, but then it's not new to them. At least they're like, oh yeah, let's go lift. Um, and it wasn't always like spur of the moment, shocked them
Yeah.
with this news, and they're F that, like I am not lifting right now. And then I also the consistency of what you do it, and this is what I've kind of realized here is like you kind of just make it the norm.
Yep.
You make here you make 4 days in the off season and 3 days throughout the preseason, and high minute guys 2 days in season, like the norm, and then they're just kind of used to it. And I think that when I first got here, some of the guys were like, "Oh, why are we training so much?" And that was early on. But then, like, I noticed slowly but surely, like, they'd walk in the weight room for their fourth day of the week and nobody would say a word. And it'd be like, what's up, man? Like, they'd be taking their shoes off and stepping on the scale to weigh in and we'd get rolling. So I think that creating this rhythm and pattern for them to kind of just get used to is
Yep.
super helpful. And that's what happened last year, too. Like, um, we trained pregame on the court with bands and med balls and stuff and ISOs and things. I had 15 minutes with small groups to do it. Occasionally we would train post game if I needed to, and then every single practice day that we were at the facility, we would train. So it's like they just got into that rhythm and they knew exactly what to expect, and we just rolled throughout the season like that.
That's the biggest thing. I think to your point as well, to your point of like keeping it fresh in their head and making sure that it's not new, because that's what kind of irritates them in my experience as well is, oh, hey, this sounds like the good idea fairy pops up. Oh, hey, this sounds like a good idea. Let's go do that. And they're like, yo, my family's here. I was going to go holler at them for a little bit. I just want to get back up. Like the mindset for them is different. But when you're like, hey, tomorrow after game, we'll hit a post game lift, 20 minutes, whatever, 30 minutes, and then we'll jump. And they're like, oh, okay, yeah, cool. That makes a lot of sense. And then it's not like a new thing. It's like hey, remember, we're going to go lift real quick. Let's go get this in. And they're like, oh, yeah, for sure. From that standpoint. Or like, hey, we're going to jump on the 4 stacks, in pregame. And they're like, wait, what? Like, because they've never done it before. And it's like, yeah, like, let's do that. Like, as close to game as possible. That's a great idea. Let's do that from that standpoint. And as long as it's something that they know and they can anticipate and expect, they typically don't have an issue with it. But when it's like the spur of the moment, like, oh crap, last second, last minute thought process, then which would be irritating for me as well, right? If I was an athlete and I just played and then a guy's like, yo, come lift, I'd be like, yeah, I'm going home. Like, see you later, bye. Like, thanks, but no thanks.
Yep.
I'll catch you later, right? So speaking of 4 stacks, man, you do a lot of work with 4 stacks and you were kind of, at some points, I want to say flipping the thought process for a lot of people. If we're looking at lower body training and total force outputs and everything from that aspect, because, you've made a couple of posts, which are fantastic, by the way, and we've kind of talked about them, but, a lot of people want to say the barbell back squat produces the most amount of force because we can obviously load that the most. And then, you're saying, hey, like on these 4 stacks, we're seeing that some of these other exercises that don't need to be loaded as much are actually producing more force. What have you seen, experienced, feedback from that? That I'm sure some people would probably just rightfully disagree with you.
Yeah. I think it's important to start with like the bias that I kind of have. And I think that when I got into this field, I don't want to generalize the field or anything like that, but I think that if you were to break down the field in terms of backgrounds, coaches, a lot of them would be football backgrounds or a background where they loved to back squat, deadlift, and bench press. And a lot of them probably still do. And that's totally fine. Like, find your niche, find what you like. A lot of people, a lot of strength coaches are wide ISAs and probably just love to grind their feet into the ground and move a bunch of weight. But that wasn't my background. I played college basketball and I never really had like a formal training program that I was ever on in college because it was a small enough college that we didn't really have a strength coach. So like our training was limited. So my like experience growing up was through learning in class, self experimentation, and knowing what things felt like from my perspective. So now taking that forward, I never really just fell into the thought process that making athletes the best power lifters possible was the way to like make them better at their sport. And every recruit that I talk to, I say, like, my goal is to make you better on the court. Now, I'm not saying we're going to do like band resistant step backs and like whatever med ball jab steps, but I just think that there's certain qualities that can be developed that aren't developed, and sometimes certain qualities that you need that are stripped by just focusing on those 3 things. So really this whole journey started with the book Force by Dan Cleather, and he was just talking about, I mean, the biggest thing was just, which this is going to sound pretty dumb, but just like truly realizing what the force equation was. And it's force equals mass times acceleration. So it's like, okay, if you're doing a 90% back squat, mass of the movement, whatever, is 400 pounds, 405, like whatever.
Yeah.
But the actual acceleration of the movement is very, very slow. So the first kind of like experiment I did was a really heavy trap bar deadlift. Well, really heavy for me, probably not for most people. Really heavy trap bar deadlift, and then compared that to a much lighter. I think it was 140 pounds lighter trap bar drop catch. And when I first went into this, like my thought process was, oh, way more weight on the bar. I'm straining so much more. Like I must be producing more force into the ground. And so I truly didn't go experiments with like a bias of like I want to see this. It was like I expect to see this, and I saw the opposite. And the trap bar deadlift at 80% produced, it was like around 3,000 newtons of force. And then I stripped 140 pounds and I did a drop catch, and it produced like 4,000 newtons of force. I was like, what the heck? Like maybe there's something. So since then, I've just been like experimenting with different movements. One of which being depth drops, another one being overcoming ISOs, and just seeing like, man, you could move a lot of like external load, but the force that you're actually putting into the ground is not that crazy. And then I think about the game of basketball, and I think like, yeah, it's a physical game for sure. Like you're hitting bodies on box outs, whatever.
Mhm.
You're trying to come off a like you're trying to run through people. So don't get me wrong, like there's a lot of physicality in this game, but I think that the things that shock me the most is watching like a guy come down the lane full speed, take like one step where he really puts on the brakes. A guy
Yep.
flies by him and he's able to like finish a floater or something. And I'm just thinking like, holy shit! Like if I was able to put a force plate under his foot right now, like the amount of it's almost this is kind of what I think about whenever you watch somebody like triple jump. The amount of
Yeah.
force that they're producing foot contacts is like
Insane.
unbelievably high. I don't know the times body weight that it actually is, but I'm sure it's astronomical. And now I'm not saying that my guys or basketball players are producing the same amount of force on some of the plays they make, but I think that it's similar. Like I think that the movement in extreme situations can be similar. And I'm like,
Yeah.
if I just guys and load these guys and they're producing whatever all off season, they're producing 2,000 newtons of force, 2,500 newtons of force, get up to 3,000, but then you just keep adding more weight, and the force they're actually producing like doesn't go up, and you hang your hat on raising a guy's 1 rep max. Are you really preparing them for what the game entails? And I think the counter argument to this that everybody has is like, well, they're playing the game and experiencing those forces, so why not just like let the game be the exposure to these high amount of forces? And my counter argument to that is these high amount of forces and these plays don't happen every day.
Often. Yeah.
But when they happen, it's either like a very important bucket or they're going to get hurt. So you
Right.
need to like build what I call like a force reserve and expose them to X amount of body weight. So then whenever they do need to produce that amount of force, they're able to and they're used to it and they've been exposed to it. And maybe you raise the ceiling on it so they're able to stop on the dime a little bit more. Or when they Euro and they would have blown out their knee, their body is used to that amount of force that they're producing and they're fine. Now, I'm not saying this is going to like prevent all injuries and make everybody super athletes, but I think that it, in my opinion, it makes more sense than just hanging our hat on 1 rep maxes.
Yeah, 1,000%. And another layer to that, I think, it also creates more buy-in from the athletes too, instead of, because it quick tangent, but it's like it's funny because I was like, oh, we're just gonna do this crazy percentage lifting, and it's like, okay, cool, like that's great, but there's a lot of downfalls with percentage lifting. Like, well, what if they don't feel like it that day, and if they're fatigued, and we're trying to push numbers, like, are we doing more harm than we are good, and all this other stuff with it, right? But to your point, and I agree with you because I have a very similar thought process. or at least when I watch it, I'm in awe because I'm like, you just did that? How did you stop on a dime, come back, and then you took 2 steps, which is essentially a bound or a euro, which is very similar to a bound, and now you are elevating to dunk or to hit a floater. And oh, by the way, you elevated 32 inches off the ground off a single leg jump, and that's impressive. And you were changing directions. You went from a lateral movement now to downhill, or however it works, and it's just like, okay, you're clearly athletic, you're clearly strong, because you don't just get to do that if you're not strong. That's not the way that it works. But then I think it goes to the adage of like, your best basketball players typically are not your best weight room guys. And then you're like, oh, let's put a bar on them. And then guys will try to put a bar on them. And it's like, you quarter squat. And they're like, yeah, I can't get any lower. And it's like, wait a minute. Something is completely off here, because you see that more and more frequently. I'm going to say maybe specifically more so in the game of basketball than other sports. But it's really interesting to see that, because it's so cool. Like when you have an appreciation for the art of it, and you have appreciation for like physiologically like what is occurring during that very short time frame in a very critical moment too. You just kind of have a massive awe and a massive appreciation. You're like, I don't know if you guys understand what you just witnessed. I know we got a bucket, but besides that, like, did you guys see everything else with it?
Yeah.
And
No,
it's pretty freaking cool.
No, you touched on like so many aspects that I wrote down a bunch of stuff from you saying that, but I'll just kind of roll through it quick. So one, I think from like a psychological perspective, doing some of these things, you almost trick these guys into really high forces, and the potential strain and like discomfort that they feel with traditional exercise isn't there. For example, right now we're doing drop catches as one of like our high force exercises, and to me that's like, people talk about like residuals and the strength residual. I'm thinking about I think force residuals. When's the last time these guys experienced high force? So a lot of people, and like every 2 weeks we would hit 80+% on a movement. Like when I was at Davis, we'd hit 80% on trap bar deadlift, 80+% every 2 weeks. And it was like, oh, we've got to touch a strength residual. And guys would be like, oh, we're going heavy on trap bar deadlift today. Like, oh, like I would get pushback every time I would try to do that. And I'd be like, fellas, strength levels, like it's very, we'll lose this quality if we don't train it every so often. So that's why we're doing it. But now I can touch some of these high force exercises that are loaded a little bit less. You move it a little bit faster, and guys like do it and they think it's like, I don't want to say easy, because especially if you add a little bit more load to it and really like drive intent of like a drop catch, like dropping fast and slamming on the brakes, like it is a hard and taxing exercise, but the actual psychological toll it takes on them is so much less. Like you kind of have to like pump yourself up a little bit for an 80+% lift. Like it's not just like a walk in cold, grab a trap bar and stand up with it. And I think there's such a psychological toll that's taken on these guys on the court, from learning new plays and preparing for a new opponent and the pressure coaches put on them, and that if I can just give them a little bit less of a psychological tool, especially in season, I want to do that, and I'm touching higher forces more often with it. And I just think that makes a more robust system. Now, I do think there is also psychological benefit from guys moving heavy weight in season, because then they dopamine, whatever you want to say, boost from like, dang, like I feel strong. But I'm just going to do that in exercises that like I am fine with. Like, hey, you can do a really heavy, like, yeah, guys bench in season because for whatever reason basketball players love to bench and they feel strong when they do it. So we will bench press and they'll feel strong a lot of weight. I've seen guys hit out of like a super heavy single arm dumbbell row. So like, cool, well, super heavy single arm dumbbell row if that makes you feel strong. But like some of my exposing like the lower body and certain tissues in the system to high forces, like I'm just going to do it this way. I don't need to back squat you to make you feel strong. The second point that I had was, it's funny, you mentioned like other sports, and how they kind of like operate, and I think about football and early on internships that I did, and it was kind of always the narrative amongst the strength staff of like, oh, the skill position coming into the weight room, like they're soft, they don't want to lift. And it's like, now when I was there, I was like, oh yeah, these guys don't want to lift, they don't want to back squat, like what a. But then you look at it from another perspective of, these guys are all probably narrow ISAs, they all just want to sprint and jump and be elastic, and now you're just like grinding them into the dirt with things that just don't fit their frame. And again, it's not a black and white scenario. Like there is a gray area where there's a time and place to do these things. There's a time and place to squat narrow ISAs and load them heavy. Like I'm not saying that you never do those things. I just think that you have to understand the structure and the athlete and what they're going to be more inclined to do. And then next point, sorry, I know you had my mind going on your last thing.
You're good. No, you're totally fine.
And then the other thing I think about that, like with some of these traditional movements, you just create like so much within the system, because in order to put a bar on your back, squat down and stand up with it, there's like a vast amount of compression that occurs, and things tighten up and you have to create that compression and pressure to be able to do some of these movements. And now, what is basketball? Don't get me wrong, there is compression that occurs, there is whatever internal rotation into the ground, but a lot of it is like rhythm, fluidity, quick expressions of high amounts of force. And I think that, like I alluded to earlier, if you were to take most basketball players and turn them into powerlifters, you're going to do far more harm to them than you are going to be benefit. Now, I think that when you get a young basketball player and you introduce to some simple traditional concepts, they're going to get a boost from it. So I'm not saying you never do those things. I'm just saying over a 4-year career, you don't need to take a basketball player's back squat to X amount of weight and like hang your hat on that, because eventually you're going to be stripping superpowers that are God given. And I think that you need to find to like bring up weaknesses, but also like bring up their ceiling. And traditional movement, I just feel like, is very limited when it comes to touching their ceiling.
1000%. I couldn't agree with it more. And it's like finding other ways, methods, modalities, exercises that you can utilize, like ones that our guys love. We love reverse lunges or real forward elevated. We love, just because it checks a lot of boxes for us, and we like it with a safety bar. And there is some compression with that, obviously, because the bar is still on the back, but it's not as uncomfortable with them as a traditional barbell, right? And you can obviously load the safety bar a little bit more, which is great, but it's not like, hey, we got to force you into this position. It's like, cool. Oh, you want 2 pads instead of 1 because you're 6'10"? Okay, great. Like, why would I force you? You know what I'm saying? Like, cool. Does that feel better?
It's also,
awesome.
Yeah, it's also just like finding ways to create clean movement patterns with some constraints. Like I think I saw the video you posted recently of doing the reverse lunge, and it's like, yeah, you have a safety bar in their back. I think you were doing hand supported, right?
Hand supported. Yep.
Yeah, they're in a position. They're able to get and move in and out of positions a little bit safer and easier, and like that's just adding constraints. Like for example, last year I had a guy who he played for the Kings. Unfortunately, ended up getting cut like right before Christmas, and now he's playing overseas. And he to bilateral squat, but he hadn't done it since college and was like, I haven't done it in a while. So I wasn't gonna put a bar on his back and back squat him because he hadn't done it in a while, and he kind of was like, I don't know, like if I love it as much as I did. But I went safety bar, I heel elevated him, and I hand supported him, and he like
Yep.
loved it, and he did, and it felt good. He liked it. I was able to load it. Like, you just add constraints for these guys because they have such unique body types, and you can find ways to load them. It's just whenever you get so married to certain exercises and it's like they have to back squat, no heel elevation, can't be hand supported because this is the king of all exercises. I'm like, that is just such bullshit.
Yeah, I agree with that. It's just like no, like no. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting for those that are still trying to fit. And I'm not saying like you don't do that stuff, but it's interesting for those that are trying to fit a square peg in a round hole and then are bashing their heads against the wall and are just like, why isn't this working? It's like, well, maybe you try a different approach. Maybe you try a
Or
different.
or why do my guys hate the weight room? Like, oh, they
Yeah,
suck. Like, my guys lift, and it's like, yeah, I wouldn't. I think of if I was in a college basketball program and my strength coach, a back squat once a week all year, we have to eight, like, I would hate it. I would hate it.
yeah, yeah. You'd be like, and no.
And
Thanks,
yeah, and
guy, but
again, that's a bias, and that's my lens, and I understand that, like, that contributes to my thought process, but it is the reality of my situation, and I just kind of like put myself in their shoes. And I'm sure, don't get me wrong, there's probably a couple players that I've worked with in my past that just wanted to power lift and potentially could reap some benefits from it. And I missed the mark because it would have been great to just do that with them. But I think that I helped a lot more people than I hurt by not hanging my hat on making really good power lifters.
yeah, 1000% right. I mean, I agree with that 1000%. It's just like doesn't make sense, you know. At the end of the day,
Yeah.
when they walk out, at the end of the day, when they walk out on the court, nobody's gonna ask them, and nobody cares. Did you front squat, back squat, split squat, and then what was your? Nobody's gonna ask them that. Nobody cares.
Yep. Yep.
Nobody cares. And so, yeah.
Yep.
So okay. So where with 4 stacks then? So where do you see that going? Let me ask this question because as you were talking about them and you're talking about force reserve,
Mhm.
where my head went to is do we then, and I know it changes based off the day and all that other stuff, but do we then essentially create like an exercise menu, if you would, that has the average amount of force that this exercise produces? And I know like the weight can be different and all this other stuff, but then we can have a better understanding and hopefully a better selection. And I even hate talking exercise selection because I think it's one of the last
Mhm.
things that we should take into consideration because there's just, I think there's just so much to it. But do we then just essentially create a force understanding of all these different exercises, primarily for the lower body, that says, hey, like the single leg RDL actually does a lot more for us. The bilateral is amazing. We love that too. Hand supported is great. And we kind of have this hierarchy of understanding of where these exercises are producing the most amount of force. And then we can add these constraints to them to adjust them. Well, what are your thoughts? Because that's where my head went.
Yeah, I think that's a really good idea. The one thing that I've like been thinking about recently, and I made a post on this and kind of like went through a self experiment, was reassessing how we like measure strength and like a new 1 rep max as opposed to like how much weight can you put on the bar and whatever squat, deadlift. It would
Right.
be how much force can you produce. And the thing that I found that
Yeah.
produces the most amount of force is a depth. I kind of went through like a little protocol where I did one depth drop from increasing height. So it was like 24-inch box. I think it was 32-inch box, 36-inch box, 40-inch box. And every time I dropped, I tried to land as stiff as possible. And every time I increased the height, my peak force went up. It was 5,000, then 6,000, then 7,500. And then I got to 48 inches and I hit 9,500 newtons. And I was like, cool. I think I added 4 inches, or maybe it was 2 inches. I went up to 50. I dropped and it was like 87.50. And I was like, oh, it went back down. Now, something that's important to remember with depth drops is like the strategy that you use to land is going to dictate how much force you produce dramatically. If I land extremely compliant and melt into the ground, my peak force is going to be super low. If I land stiff as hell, like my peak force is going to be super high. So once I got to that 48-inch box, I hit 9,500. I went up, I went down. I did one more drop at 50 inches, tried to land as absolutely stiff as possible. And I still didn't hit 9,500 newtons. So I was like, okay, in my opinion, the max amount of force, my like force producing capacity is 9,500 newtons. So that's like my 1 rep max now. Now I want to be able to train with some of these things that I talk about as like a self experiment. I want to be able to do a lot of drop catches. I want to do a lot of drops, mix in some overcoming ISOs, even though it's potentially a little bit different strategy. And now I want to reassess that and see if I hit 10,000 newtons. And now to your question about like an exercise library, I think that having a progression based off force exposure is extremely important. And that's what I've kind of like been thinking about. Like if I were to look at an entire off season, it might be like, if we're looking a single leg movement like rear foot elevated, because I love them, maybe you are doing whatever, higher volume elevated, then you work up to lower volume, higher intensity rear foot elevated. And then once you get guys to a certain point, like if they're holding 125s in their hands for a couple reps, like, okay, do I really need to give them the 130s, the 135s? So now we might go to like a rear foot elevated drop catch. Now we might cut that back down to 60% and have them hit drop catches. I know the force exposure is going to be higher than a really heavy rear foot elevated split squat. Once they get to, we did these like throughout the preseason. Once you get to about like 70%, and I understand it's a rear foot elevated split squat, so it's not a perfect percentage, but to give you an idea, once you get to about like 70-ish%, it starts to get really freaking heavy for some of these stronger guys to do a drop catch. So then I think that the next progression could be something that I call like a forward lunge drop catch, to where you're standing on a couple blocks. You drop off the block, like you're up tall, drop off the blocks, slam on the brake. You can be holding minimal amount of weights. What I've seen is like crazy force from that. So that was pretty like an example to say that, yes, I think that there should be a progression. And I think in a perfect world, you're progressing. And this is kind of how I think you're progressing by the force exposed to the athlete as opposed to just like weight. Because using the example I just like, you continue to just like, all right, he hit 125s in each hand for 2 reps. Let's give him the 130s. Like, hell yeah, you hit the 135s. Like, you are just hanging your hat like yourself. You know, it's like, what are you really giving the athlete? But then the thing that gets tricky with some of these exercises, and I alluded to this drop, is like it's super important the strategy that you use to perform the movement. And everything that I've done on the force plates, other than having some of my low minute guys do some depth drops, most of this has been like a self experiment. So I know the force that I produce in these movements. And I would say, as long as you're like with relative weight and cue the correct strategy, I'm sure you'll be in the ballpark. But it's going to be, I would say it's going to be a little bit different for everybody. And that's actually been on my to-do list of like, we have a group of interns and I'm like, hey, I'm going to put my interns through some of these exercises and just see kind of like coach them as I would my athletes. Hey, you're going to hold moderate weight. I want you to drop fast, slam on the brakes, whatever, stick it like a statue, and see the force that they movements to know if it's like a bandwidth, a close ballpark. Because it's not realistic to have all my guys do every exercise on plates. So I think
was just gonna go there.
Step,
yeah.
If we had 8 plates, then yeah, I would do that. But I think the next step is kind of creating a library based off these exercises. And I've kind of been doing it with certain progressions, but then like knowing a bandwidth of force exposure, then you can program with that as opposed to just like progressing an exercise with weight.
Yeah, because the thought that I was having as you were explaining this, and maybe everybody else too is like, okay, well, what about the logistical constraints that would have to occur if you're training even a small group, right? Let's say it's 5 people, right? Or
Mhm.
somewhere in that neck of the woods, 4 to 6, right? And you have one set of plates or two sets of plates. I think two sets of plates with 6 people actually wouldn't be terrible because you can go 3 and 3, and it's like,
Yep.
okay, that's a lot more manageable. But then it's like, well, do we just stay at one spot because we are trying to get on the force deck as much as possible? Which is just an interesting thing because you don't really know yet, right? Like you're like, man, I think it's a great idea, but I think some people would be like, well, what about the logistical constraints? But I think if you have a bandwidth of like 500 newtons or 7,500 or 750 newtons differential on plus or minus, we could start to categorize some of these things and say, this is a high force, this is a medium force, this is a low force output, obviously based upon, the constraints of your programming and, are you doing higher volume, less weight, or are you doing, the opposite of that? And so there's a level of components to that, which I think take
Yep.
time to think about, which is great, and we need to. But then at least we have the opportunity to think about that, right? Everybody has this tech now. I shouldn't say everybody, but a lot of people do, and they only use it to jump. And it's like, well, that's great, but the whole idea is to ensure that a program is making them better, right? And so we could wait 6 weeks to retest, or a week or whatever, to be like, did we get better? Because now we're done with the cycle. And it's like, well, yes, maybe, but you could also just categorize your stuff a little bit differently and then feel more confident when that does occur to be like, yeah, we did get better. And that makes sense because we backwards planned based off of all the data that we have to show we did this, and then we did this. And then you can kind of vertically integrate high force, medium force, low force days, and then have themes to them rather than just max strength. And you can start to then say, how do we layer our training with a higher level thought process that hopefully has the most benefit for our guys based upon their needs analysis from the force stacks, and say, you need more force, you need more acceleration, right? Because, time to takeoff is an important thing, or velocity at takeoff. If we're talking about acceleration, like that is velocity at takeoff. Okay, cool. How can we make that? How can we improve that? What can we do to reduce that? Do we put them in these positions that are a weakness for them in order to improve their strengths and stuff? So it's really interesting when you think about that at different levels rather than just we jump once a week and that's sufficient.
Yeah, and I think that that's a really good point, and that was really good, like some of potentially where this could go. And I think that the logistical piece is something that like is an obvious potential constraint because all of this is dictated not on like visual weight on the bar. Like that's an easy thing to measure, but it's actual force going into the ground. But I think that like for one, you could have one set of and run quite a bit of people through like depth drops because
Yes.
to compare it with a couple things, like you can get, I would say you could get up to like 8 people in a session through some depth drops pretty cleanly and like not have too much of a backup. If you just, hey, it's one drop at various heights, everybody drops, they're pairing it with different things, you add a little bit more height, like you can get most people through. Um, and then also, I think that once the experience front end and you have a idea and a bandwidth of what certain exercises produce, you just have to do a job of coaching the execution of the movement. It's no
Yes.
longer did you complete the rep with the weight on the bar. It's now like, hey, drop faster. Hey, slam on the brakes a little bit harder. Hey, you need to be a statue. Like you have to actually coach the movement to get the force that you want out of it. And I think that's the beautiful thing of like, you're now just no longer like, hey, stand up with this weight, like, hey, drive, 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 drive. Cool, you got the rep. Like, no, it's that rep wasn't good enough. You need to have higher intent on your drop. You need to have a stiffer landing. And I think that that like execution piece some people might be like, well, it's so variable. It's like, well, just coach the shit out of it and make it look the way you want it to look. Because if you can get the intent out of these, I think that the results and like the stimulus that you're giving is vast.
On top of that, the intent of training for the athlete goes up. It's similar to VBT, right? I'm a big proponent of VBT. I love it. I think it's awesome. Because it gives you that instantaneous feedback. And the intent of training goes up instead of being like, add more weight, which is fine. But you could also say, hey, like drive the bar to the ceiling faster, punch faster, or whatever the case may be. And that now gets them engaged in it, and they can see the numbers, they can read the numbers, all this other stuff. But it's now the aspect of like, I don't necessarily care how much weight is on the bar, but what I do care about is the quality of the movement. And to your point, you are now coaching better and more rather than just like, add 5 pounds to that, please. And they get sick of that. I'm not gonna lie. They get sick of that, right? They're like,
I don't think it drives them as much as like it drives us, And then
right.
the other, alluding to the days of how you structure your stuff, is what I've kind of like worked on over the last year plus is this system, and this component that we just talked about is just like one aspect
Yes.
I use. So like what I call like the force system is the high force, which we talked about, and then there's also fast force, slow force, and human force, and that's kind of like the entire system. And then now we could probably have like a podcast episode on each of those because we just had one on high force. But this isn't how I approach 100% of my training. This is how I approach 25% of my training, and then there's 75% that's made up from these other components that I think complement each other really, really well. That's probably saved for another conversation because there's depth to each of these pieces. But
Of course.
I just wanted to make that point that it's not like I think like every day, how can I expose these guys to as much force as possible? It's how do I give high force stimuli and then apply some fast force, sprinkle in some slow, and give them a touch of human. And then I think, in my opinion, and this is kind of why I've been working on it and kind of like framing this all together, is like this creates a very well-rounded program. And it's not real by any means. It's just taking a bunch of pieces from a bunch of different people and putting it into a system that makes the most sense to me.
Yeah, I think that's fantastic. And I think that would help people categorize their training and their thought processes. I want to know how I want to explain this, but it'll help them organize their days better. And then when you say, we're going to get after this exercise, whatever it may be, here's what I mean by that. And what I mean by that is we're going to get a high force day. Cool, great. Maybe we pair that with some sprinting or whatever else. Maybe it's a max V day or something or whatever. I don't know. Yeah. But then you can start to have all these layers to everything. And like you said, it's 25% of your training. It's primarily for the lower body, right?
Yeah.
And you could probably apply it to an upper body aspect as well, maybe for pitchers or whatever. Cool, great. But primarily for the lower body thing. So, Hunter, that was fantastic. Where can people find you online, man?
Yeah, so I'm the most active on Instagram. My name on Instagram is Hunter Eyes, EIS_SP. Twitter, I'm not doing too much other than just like retweeting stuff. And then, as you mentioned earlier, I do have my own podcast called Move the Needle. My co-host is Mike Sullivan. Started that a couple months ago and enjoy that a lot. As you probably enjoy yours quite a bit too. And then we also have a Instagram page where we're posting some content at Move the Needle _ perform.
Yeah, that's awesome, bro. Well, man, I want to say thank you. I appreciate you coming on, and it was always such a great conversation, and it gets my mind thinking, and I hope I got yours thinking as well. And so I just want to say thank you. Thanks for your time. good luck tonight, man. I look forward to our paths crossing and linking up here pretty soon.
Yeah, appreciate it, man.
Yeah, absolutely. Guys, hey, look, here's the deal. If you got something from this, do us a huge favor, share the show. If you didn't get anything from this at one, I just didn't think you were listening or paying attention. So do us a huge favor, share the show. That's the only way it grows. Reach out to Hunter, listen to his podcast as well. I learn a ton from his podcast. He has great guests on and the thought process as well. And so if you guys liked it, share the show, leave a review. Other than that, Hunter, appreciate you, man. Good luck tonight, and look forward to seeing everybody and talking to y'all here real soon, man.
Thank you, Kendrick. Appreciate it.
Yes, sir.